rain fell like ash over London, grey and relentless, washing the soot of empire from stone, buildings that stood like monuments to both glory and guilt. Beneath the echo of carriage wheels and the distant tolling of St. Paul's, a secret ledger changed hands. Parchment, thick with ink, signatures and silence. The man who carried it wore the polished shoes of respectability, but his trembling fingers betrayed the weight of what they held. Proof that Britain's greatness had not been built upon virtue, but upon the bones of the broken. The year was 1787. The Thames was swollen with trade. Barrels of sugar, cotton, rum, and gold floated along its banks, each one carrying the story of another world's suffering. Dock workers shouted in accents from every corner of the empire, while above them the merchants of the city counted profits in counting houses. Perfumed with tobacco smoke, a portrait of King George III hung over one such office, smiling benevolently down upon men who spoke not of nation, but of numbers. Another shipment from the Indies, muttered Thomas Harrow, a clerk, with weary eyes and ink-stained cuffs. He had seen the ledgers, seen the names erased, the bribes paid, the falsified cargo manifests. He knew the ships carried more than goods. They carried ghosts. But in an empire built on commerce, silence was gold. And gold, after all, was the crown's truest faith. In Westminster, the illusion was complete. Politicians toasted prosperity. Artists painted Britannia as divine. And the public was fed tales of courage and civilization. Yet, beneath the marble floors of the Treasury, deals were struck with bloodless precision. The East India Company, a state within a state, funneled its spoils from Bengal straight into royal coffers. The famine that had claimed millions in India was spoken of as a misfortune, even as the ships that followed brought home silver, silk, and saltpeter. At Windsor, the Queen's jewels glittered, diamonds once embedded in the crowns of Indian Maharajas. In Bristol, the docks grew rich on the trade of human lives, as African captives were exchanged for goods that would sweeten the tables of London's elite. And yet amidst the glitter of empire, something stirred. Letters written in secret, voices rising in taverns, whispers among the dock workers. If the crown's gold comes from chains, one man said, then what kind of kingdom have we built? The camera would linger here, on the ledger clutched to Thomas Harrow's chest, on the flickering candle that illuminated both truth and danger. Outside, the church bells rang for evening prayers, their chimes swallowed by the restless murmur of a city built on secrets. The morning mist rolled across the docks of Bristol like breath from an unseen beast. The ships moored there groaned under their own guilt, their hulls dark with salt and something else, something heavier. Chains clinked faintly in the cargo holds, though the ships had been emptied days ago. Men smoked pipes on the quay, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid that the sea itself might remember what it had carried. Thomas Harrow arrived from London with his coat buttoned tight and his conscience looser by the hour. The ledger he carried had grown heavier, its ink seeming darker with every mile. He had been sent to inspect irregularities, though he knew what the phrase meant in the language of His Majesty's Treasury. Not to expose wrongdoing, but to ensure it stayed buried. He walked past warehouses stacked with barrels marked Jamaica and Gold Coast, their scents of molasses and sweat mingling in the air. A young boy ran past him barefoot, humming a sailor's tune, one that slaves had once been forced to sing to keep rhythm at the oars. Thomas paused. His stomach turned. In a tavern near the docks, the men who ran the trade gathered in candlelight. The air was thick with tobacco and deceit. One of them, a portly man with gold rings on his fingers, leaned close to Thomas. "You're the Crown's man, aren't you?" he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "We serve the same master, Mr. Harrow," Let's not pretend otherwise. On the wall behind them hung a painting of Britannia, holding her trident aloft, her other hand resting on a globe. It was meant to symbolize power. To Thomas it looked more like possession. As the night deepened, talk turned to profits, ships, and routes. Jamaica, Sierra Leone, Calcutta. Each name was spoken with reverence, as if they were sacred places rather than scarred ones. Thomas listened, his pen unmoving over his notes. Every sentence he wrote could ruin men who dined with kings. Yet every silence he kept bought him safety and coin. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had begun again. He looked toward the sea, a black mirror stretching endlessly east and west, and imagined the thousands who had crossed it unwillingly. Somewhere in the darkness a bell tolled from a distant ship. He thought of the crown, shining, heavy, and pure, and wondered how much blood it had taken to polish it so bright. The sound of the bell faded, replaced by the whisper of waves against wood. Each one, he thought, sounded like a name the Empire had chosen to forget. The corridors of power smelled of wax and wealth. In Westminster, where the Empire's heart beat behind velvet curtains, silence was as valuable as gold. Ministers walked with deliberate steps, their wigs powdered, their faces pale from candlelight and calculation. Outside, the city roared, beggars, traders, and soldiers. But within these walls, the Empire was distilled into numbers on parchment. Thomas Harrow stood in the shadow of the Treasury's marble columns, the damp of Bristol still clinging to his coat. The ledger he carried was wrapped in cloth, as though modesty could hide its ugliness. He had seen the entries, the losses, marked beside entire shipments of human lives, the investments in plantations, the bribes listed under names that could never be spoken aloud. The ink bled through the pages like rot beneath polished skin. He was ushered into a chamber lined with mahogany and arrogance. Lord Halifax, a man whose smile could slice glass, motioned him forward. "You've done fine work, Harrow," the Lord said smoothly, pouring brandy into 2 glasses. "But understand this. Britain's prosperity is not built upon sin. It's built upon necessity." Thomas stared at the amber liquid, its surface trembling slightly. "Necessity," he repeated, his voice thin. "And what of justice, my lord?" Halifax's laughter was soft, almost kind. "Justice," he said, "is a luxury of peace. Empire is war, endless, invisible war, and someone must win it." Outside the window, the city stretched like a living map of hierarchy. Carriages rolled through the rain, carrying ladies to operas funded by Colonial sugar. The poor huddled in alleyways, their faces hollow. The same empire that had stolen continents now stole its own people's bread. That night, as the gas lamps flickered, Thomas walked the streets of London alone. He passed the Bank of England, its great stone facade cold as judgment. He saw the Royal Exchange, where traders laughed and shouted beneath the mottos, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." A beggar-woman reached out her hand to him, her accent Irish, her eyes starving. "Spare a penny, sir," she whispered. He hesitated, then gave her a coin. Silver stamped with the face of the king. She turned it in her palm, the monarch's image catching the lamplight. "Strange," she murmured, "how one man's face can buy another's hunger." Thomas watched her disappear into the fog, her words echoing in his chest. He looked down at the ledger one last time. It was no longer a book of numbers. It was a confession. The wind rose from the river, carrying with it the sound of distant bells. Westminster, or perhaps warning. Somewhere in the night, something in Thomas Harrow began to break. The year turned, and with it came a tension that hummed beneath. London's polished civility like a taut string ready to snap. Pamphlets began to circulate, crude, hand-printed pages slipped through tavern doors and pinned to church gates. Who profits from the lash? One read, "How many bodies make a pound?" Another bore no words at all. Only the crown, drawn dripping red. Thomas Harrow watched them multiply like whispers in the wind. He had not written them, but his conscience had. The ledger, now hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his small Bloomsbury room, pulsed in his mind like a living wound. He could no longer sleep without hearing the sea, or the cries of unseen men beneath deck. One morning, as he walked along Fleet Street, he saw a crowd gathered outside a print shop. At its center stood a young man with fire in his voice. William Wilberforce, the rising member of Parliament, whose speeches against the slave trade had begun to rattle the gilded cages of power. Our empire, Wilberforce declared, is dressed in moral grandeur but fed on cruelty. We speak of civilization while trading in chains. Britain's wealth, he raised a trembling hand, is stained with the misery of millions. The crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in jeers, but Thomas stood still, his pulse quickening. Wilberforce's words were dangerous, but they were true. That evening a knock came at Thomas's door. Two men entered, agents of the crown, their coats dark, their faces darker. "Mr. Harrow," one said smoothly, "we've reason to believe certain records from Bristol have gone missing." Thomas's throat tightened. "Records?" he managed. "Ledgers, letters, evidence." A pause. "You understand the consequences of misplacing royal property, don't you?" When they left, the air in his room felt heavier than the ledger beneath the floorboards. He knew now. His silence had been purchased not just with money, but with fear. That night London burned, not with fire, but with truth. More pamphlets, more speeches, more names whispered in corridors. The East India Company trembled under scrutiny. The abolitionist movement gained momentum, carried by voices that refused to be silenced. Thomas walked to the river at dawn. The Thames flowed black and wide, its surface reflecting the first pale light of morning. He took the ledger from beneath his coat and opened it one last time. The ink had faded, but the crimes remained. He tore a single page free, one that bore the signatures of men who now sat in Parliament, and slipped it into his pocket. Then with a slow breath, he dropped the ledger into the water. It vanished without a sound, but as he turned away, the bells of St. Paul's began to ring, not for Mass, but for reckoning. The dawn of the 19th century arrived like the slow lifting of a veil, revealing not purity, but the scars beneath the crown. The empire still glittered, its banners a-fluttering across continents, but the shine had dulled. The people were beginning to see. In coffee houses and chapels, whispers had grown into demands. Abolition, reform, restitution. Thomas Harrow, older now, lived quietly in a modest house along the outskirts of London. His once steady hand trembled when he wrote, not from age, but from the weight of what he had chosen to reveal. The page he had stolen from the ledger had become more than paper. It was evidence. And through quiet allies, dissenting clergymen, printers, and Wilberforce's circle, its contents had reached the floor of Parliament. In 1807, when the Slave Trade Act passed, the church bells of Britain rang for freedom. The streets filled with celebration, with people shouting, crying, embracing strangers. But Thomas stood at the edge of it all, his face unreadable. He knew what others did not, that the empire had outlawed the trade, but not the system that had birthed it. The plantations still thrived, the companies still reaped, the crown still glittered, paid for by suffering far away. He walked by Westminster that night, the glow of gas lamps shimmering against the wet stones. Inside, politicians congratulated one another. Toasts, speeches, promises of moral victory. Outside, a thin boy sold sugar drops for pennies, his goods wrapped in paper stamped with the royal seal. The irony was almost poetic. a journalist approached Thomas. A young woman named Eleanor Briggs, one of the new breed of writers, unafraid to challenge power. "You were there, weren't you?" she asked softly, "at the beginning of it all. The ledgers, the lies." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I was a witness," he said, "and a coward." Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "Then tell me the truth. Tell me how this empire was built." He looked toward the Thames, black under the moonlight, the river that had carried so much wealth and so much sorrow. "It was built," he said slowly, on a silence so vast that even the dead could not fill it. Years later, after his death, Eleanor's articles would ignite new outrage. Her serialized exposé, Secrets Beneath the Crown, would reveal what Britain preferred to forget. The money trails, the forged documents, the royal complicity, the empire, once untouchable, began to tremble under the weight of its own history. In the final shot, if this were film, the camera would drift over the Thames at dusk. The water glows gold, reflecting the skyline of London, rich and eternal. But beneath the surface, faint outlines shimmer, pages, coins, chains, ghosts of a wealth that had never been pure. And as the screen fades to black, a voice echoes softly. "Empires do not fall when their enemies rise. They fall when their secrets are finally believed." The story doesn't end here. Next episode, How America Took Over the World. Subscribe and step deeper into the dark side of history. Every empire rises, and every empire falls. But what happened next will shock you. Don't miss the next episode. How America Took Over the World. Subscribe now and join us again as we uncover the secrets that time tried to bury.